everybody. Hey, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our, I guess this is our second Christ and Culture talk that we've done recently. When we first started Exilic, we actually did a lot of these, but we kind of went on hiatus, and now we're starting to implement it back. We're calling this an Asian American moment, and we have the pleasure of welcoming Pastor Abe Cho. He really doesn't need much of an introduction because he's a familiar face here at Exilic, but Abe is with City to City full-time. He's also an associate pastor at Redeemer East Harlem. He's a personal hero of mine. After I first met Abe, I said, hey, I really want to grow my beard out. And then my wife said no, so then we just ended up having a fourth kid to kind of imitate Abe. Abe is a proud father of 4 children, husband to Jordan. And he's a really valuable mentor and older brother to Aaron and I. So we're very blessed, and we really wanted him to come and to share with our church. So we're going to go ahead and get started then. So we kind of broke up the talk a little bit generally along the lines of kind of the past. Where has the Asian American Church been? What is unique about this present moment, and then kind of where are we going? What might we contribute? So we're going to go ahead and get started, but I do want to let you know that you can also ask questions. So we're going to talk. We're going to have kind of Aaron and Abe talk for about 40 minutes, but then we also want to leave time for questions from you. And if you would like to ask a question, you can go to slido.com/exilic. Slido.com/exilic, and you will be able to input a question there, and we'll kind of field the questions, and if we have time and we're able to get to them, we will do that. So we were kind of envisioning more of a podcast-style conversation here, and the genesis of this is in June, we actually hung out with Abe in Memphis, Tennessee, at our PCA's General Assembly, and we had a lot of late-night conversations with Abe, and we're like, man, it would be great if our people could listen in on this. So that was kind of the genesis of this event, and that's kind of what we're trying to recreate here. So just to kind of get us started off, do you want anything to say, Aaron, by way of introduction?
No, I mentioned this in the announcement, but this topic has become a growing fire in my belly because of how important I think this is, and I'm still kind of thinking through this stuff as well. But I'm hoping that our conversation today can be a helpful way of being a catalyst for you guys as well to think about.
Okay, so just to get us started, I think that, I don't know if you would agree, but the Asian American Church has largely remained siloed from the broader Evangelical Church in America. If so, why do you think that is? Why do you think that has traditionally been the case? I think even here in New York City, the Asian American Church has been considerably more underrepresented compared to the Black church, Jewish communities, as well as white Evangelical Church. What might be some historical or anthropological context behind how this came to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are several factors that kind of come immediately to mind when I think about that. I think on the one hand, historically, the Asian American Church, and certainly if we're talking East Coast, and then I grew up in the Korean American Church, our immigration patterns probably go back at earliest to like 1965. And so really we're talking about large waves of immigration largely happening in the 60s and 70s. And I think part of the reason why there's been a little bit of a siloing is that in those early days of immigration, there was just a lot of like immigrant community-based needs that I think the early Korean church was meeting, or the Asian immigrant church was meeting. So maybe my mother's story might be a little bit emblematic of what was going on in that generation. So my mom, when she immigrated to the U.S. in 1975, I guess it was, she wasn't a Christian. My dad was a Christian, but in her immigration experience, what she discovered was, upon arriving at the airport in the U.S., it was a Korean church pastor that met them at the airport it was that church community that helped her to find a job. She didn't speak much English. So found a job, helped them to find an apartment, helped them to figure out all these different things. My dad was, he was here for doctoral studies, and so he was a student. And what she experienced in that immigration, that immigrant experience, was an entire community of people that didn't know who she was, had no idea, and yet there was such a holistic embrace of her. And it was in that context of that community, which became like family here in the U.S., where she didn't speak the language, that's where she converted and became a Christian. And so when I think about just the relatively short history of immigration, that, again, East Coast, Korean American in particular, but I think even Asian American in general, that's part of it. So it was meeting a lot of our own immigrant community needs, and so there's plenty there to kind of keep us busy. I think maybe related to that, a second factor is probably some of the language barriers, right? So that linguistic barrier kind of puts us a little bit in a silo where we're trying to find other people who speak the same language and culture and having a harder time kind of breaking into mainstream conversations if English isn't kind of a primary language. But I think a third factor too, well, I guess now I'm thinking about a fourth factor. A third factor is, I think, this is like my hunch. It's based on nothing except for feelings inside my heart, so you might disagree with this, but I feel like Asian Americans, we've taken a while to kind of come into our own as far as our own ethnic identity. So I was born here in the States. And so constantly navigating this, we're not Korean enough, or we're not Asian enough, but we're also not American enough. I don't know about your households, but in my household, kind of like the goal was always some form of assimilation. So don't draw attention to the fact that you're different. Put your head down, work hard, don't rock the boat, don't cause problems. That was kind of like the ideal minority posture, as it were. And so I think because of all those factors, and there are probably cultural factors that play as well, that have, in my mind, has led us to take a while to come into our own, to say, no, being Korean American or Asian American is not something to downplay or to not talk about, or even it's not something to be embarrassed about, but it's actually part of the gift that God has given to me for the church and for American society as a whole. Or even, what does it mean for me to be part of a Korean American identity? Because when I go to Korea, it's clear that I'm not really Korean. But here in the U.S., I'm never quite fully accepted as American as well. So I think there's something about that process that is just taking us some time, and that's okay. And I think related to that, when it comes to churches as well, I think Asian Americans, we've oftentimes seen Asian American ministries as kind of like a glorified youth group, right? So we kind of still feel like if it's English and it's Asian American, it doesn't quite feel like it's like a legitimate, serious ministry. And I think that's kind of part of it as well. So those are some initial thoughts that come to mind that has led us to kind of where we are and why we maybe feel newer to a broader landscape conversation.
Yeah, just to add to that very briefly, it's hard not to feel siloed when you feel like you're in survival mode, which is what our parents' generation were in. And so I think there are reasons why that silo kind of took place, because you needed that kind of village that you were familiar with to help you survive here.
So just talking about that, so if you think about what you just said about immigration patterns, that the 60s and the 70s were largely when the biggest Asian American movements of immigration happened. So what that means is that the Asian American church right now is still, I wouldn't say infancy, but maybe more of adolescence, right? Because the Asian American church is new, and especially a church like ours, where classically Asian American churches have been part of like the Chinese ministry or the Korean ministry and then the English ministry. So that's kind of how it started. I think churches like ours that are kind of a plant or a new church that is just Asian American, that's relatively new in our country where we're not really seeing that. So I guess one question related to this would be, do we need Asian American churches? Do we need ethnic minority churches? Or should we just all kind of assimilate into the broader evangelical church? How would you kind of respond to that?
Yeah, so this is a topic that I've been thinking about a lot. So pre-George Floyd, One of the comments that I heard about the most in our church was from Asian Americans. They would say, Exilic is too Asian, so I don't know if I want to come here. And what they meant is I want to go to a white church where there are also Asians, because that's more legitimate, or that's a true church, or that's varsity. What's interesting is that post-George Floyd, I haven't heard one person make that kind of comment. And a part of that is because I think our church has now all of a sudden become an oasis, a refuge, a haven for Asian Americans to process what Asian Americans actually go through. And so that level of self-hate that I saw pre-George Floyd has dissipated a lot. And all of us have gone on this racial journey, right, to a certain degree, but I've seen a lot more people sort of embrace their Asian American identity, and as a result of that, see a church where there are Asian Americans as a place that is actually like home, a place where you don't have to code switch like you do Monday through Friday. And I think that's imperative for one main reason. We are in exile, right? We're not home yet in heaven, right, where our citizenship is. So unless we find a home away from home, you're going to feel twice as exiled. Does that make sense? So the church has to be a home when we are exiled. If the church can't feel like home, then you'll doubly feel lonely, right? And so when J. Caspian Kang wrote his book, The Loneliest Americans, and he was talking about Asian Americans, that's us. And so what I've seen take place is, for many people in our communities, they've actually seen our place as a place where they can be their authentic selves without having to apologize for being too Asian. And I think that's really important to have as we're on this pilgrimage, a real place where we can call home as we're in exile.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and even the timeline when it comes to George Floyd maybe being something of a turning point. I think maybe a way that I would think about that is that up until that point, I do think there was some version of kind of assimilation as being the goal, right? So, like for me, the Korean church was the place where I was able to just be myself, so I didn't have to constantly explain who I was and that sort of a thing. So I experienced both an ethnic identity formation in parallel with kind of my spiritual identity formation. So I met Jesus in an entirely Korean American context, and I was also making peace with what does it mean for me to be Korean American in a dominant culture world in America. But I think there was still a trajectory overall that was still kind of seeking after some form of assimilation. So I think a lot of Asian American churches, when they talk about wanting to be more multi-ethnic, really what they mean is wanting to see more white folks in the church, right? Wanting to see more dominant culture people in the church, because that in some way would legitimize the work that they're doing. So I think there's something of that trajectory that was still in the background for the way that we thought about who we were. But I think there's something that happens with George Floyd, and also probably the anti-Asian hate that we all experience, that made us say, well, what if was never meant to be the goal? Like, what if there's something about my Asian Americanness that isn't meant to be peripheral, that actually is part of the gift, the charism that we bring to the church and society at large? And so I think churches like Exilic become this incredible place where I'm like watching what's happening here with a ton of curiosity, because I think there was a time where all younger English-speaking Asian Americans were trying to find basically a white church. But now we're seeing some of the fastest growing churches being Asian American, and I would say unapologetically so, proudly so. And I think there's something happening there that the Spirit's at work, and so I'm excited to see what does it mean for us to develop an Asian American identity and voice within the context of the Christian faith, and how does that contribute to the larger conversation? I think it's going to be a crucial piece. Yeah.
Just to add to that too, sometimes our church is criticized for not being multi-ethnic, but our church is actually quite multi-ethnic. I would say we're even more multi-ethnic than a white and black church. Because in a white and black church, how many languages are typically spoken? One, just English, right?
You speak three languages, trilingual, two languages, bilingual, one language, you're American, right? In our church, how many languages are spoken? I don't even know. There's a good amount of different languages that are being spoken here. And so our skin might look the same, but culturally, there are differences here, right? And even within the Asian community, there's a history of genocide and hatred and stuff like that. And so our church is actually multi-ethnic. And what I would say is how we normally think about the multi-ethnic church, sometimes those environments are actually the most unsafe spaces for minorities. Because even within the quote-unquote multi-ethnic church, there still is a dominant culture. And that culture is still typically white. And so everyone else has to kind of fall into line within that dominant culture. And so what happens is you have all these minorities that are in the multi-ethnic church, but they don't feel seen. They don't feel like they belong. They don't feel like they have a seat at the table. And so sometimes the traditional understanding of the multi-ethnic church is the most unsafe space for minorities. And so this is where we do need Black churches. We do need Asian American churches. We do need Latino American churches. Like, we need all different kinds of churches, not just the traditional multi-ethnic church.
Yeah, some questions have been coming in, and I was going to save these for the end, but I think they're kind of related to what we're talking about now. One of them was kind of classic, where you were just talking about how would you respond to the argument that Christians shouldn't see color within its body? We shouldn't identify as the Asian American church or the Black church. Another question we got was, what steps can we take to proactively make our church more multicultural? And that's kind of what you were just talking about. I think a good exercise is, how do you define multicultural, right? Because in an Asian American church, Asian American is interesting because it covers so many different cultural groups that are very different. Like, at least even in like Hispanic cultures, you have common shared language. Amongst Asian Americans, you really don't. So I think the way you define multicultural is important. I do think churches should try to be as inclusive as possible to all cultures, where we're not alienating anybody, we're welcoming everybody, but at the same time, I don't think that being too Asian is something, I think it's something we need to stop apologizing for, because we've classically done that too much. I get asked sometimes, hey, what are you guys doing to make Exilic more diverse? And I hear in that question less Asian. And I asked them, hey, would you go to a Black church and ask them that question? What are you doing to make this church less or more diverse? Probably not. And a lot of times they say, actually, I probably wouldn't. But there's something about the Asian American culture that makes it feel like we need to apologize for that. So anything else you want to add?
Well, I think to that first question about should we be thinking in terms of color or race or ethnicity to begin with, I think it's a great question. Because we don't see biblically grounded warrant for that. We could just be kind of getting swept up in, cultural identity politics and that sort of thing. But if you look at Revelation 7, what I love about that part in the book of Revelation is that the Apostle John is writing about the vision that he sees. And in that final vision, so this is a vision, it's not someone explaining, it's not book, it's not readings, it's a vision. So he sees something, and just by looking at the faces of the people who are in the crowd worshiping Jesus, he knows it's every tribe, nation, tongue that's represented around the throne of the Lamb. So there's something visually different about the people. And I think, I'll have to go back and check again, but I think at this point, everyone's actually wearing white robes. And so it's like everyone's dressed the same, but just by looking at it, what is he seeing? He's seeing color. He's seeing different shades of skin. He's seeing the diversity. And so there's something crucially important about the differences that God in his wisdom has embedded in all of the human race. That's part of what God seeks to redeem. So our future is not a monocultural reality that's stripped of our ethnic particularities. Our future is our ethnic particularity sanctified in Christ and made one in Christ. So all the difference gathered in, and all of the richness being brought in to glorify Jesus. So our ethnic identities actually matter profoundly. One of my favorite passages, I was just teaching this in a class earlier, but is Isaiah 60. And what I love about it is that the vision of Isaiah 60 is the New Jerusalem, the mountain of God. So it's on top of the mountain, Mount Zion. We see a picture of the New Jerusalem. And what we see the kings of the nations bringing in all the riches of their cultures. And what that tells me is that God doesn't just care about culture in the singular, as if there's a single human culture. God cares about cultures in the plural. There's a line in there that says that God desires the gold and incense from Sheba. So God is not interested in gold as a precious metal as such. God is interested in gold as a specific cultural product of Sheba in particular. So there's something about the concreteness of our cultures that I think matters profoundly to God. And part of what that means as Asian Americans is to recognize that the way to move closer to the New Jerusalem is, again, not to downplay or deny or reject or even harbor shame around the difference that God has given to us, but instead to say, this is the riches that I'm called to steward because my African American, my white American, they need the riches that God has embedded into my culture. I need to bring that to the table. And then one last thought when it comes to diversity. I've started to now work with Redeemer City to City, so I'm now engaging with church planters all across the globe. And whenever we talk about diversity, in North America, we think we know what diversity is, and at some level we do. We're wrestling with it. But you want to talk about diversity, to Gene, your point, the head of our Asia Pacific affiliates, the Cities of the Asia Pacific, in America, we struggle to have our training in two languages, English and Spanish. Like, we're having a really hard time with that. In Asia Pacific, and they've only been around for like maybe 10 years, they've already translated all the materials in something like 7 different languages. They're having to think through not just East Asian contexts, but South Asian contexts. They're having to think through what does evangelism look like in the Muslim majority world in Asia, in the Hindu majority world, in the Buddhist. So the level of diversity that Asia Pacific affiliate leader has to think through is like mind-boggling to me. And it's just not the same as in, again, Latin America, right? As long as you're doing it in Spanish, there's differences in those countries and cultures for sure. So not trying to make them, kind of a singular culture, but the level of diversity or the layers that you have to work through are just wildly different. And so I do think there's a place for us to say, well, let's talk about what we mean by multi-ethnicity. Sorry, one last thought. I keep on talking. I think every church has to wrestle with 2 questions. I mean, obviously there's other questions, but 2 questions when it comes to their mission. And I think both of these questions are equally important. One is the question, what's the demographic that we're trying to reach? So there's no single church that's going to reach all different kinds of people. So what's the demographic that we're trying to reach? But I think the second equally important question that every church needs to wrestle with is, what dividing wall are we trying to breach? So what demographic are we trying to reach, and what dividing wall are we seeking to breach? So this is Ephesians chapter 2, right? Tearing down the dividing wall of hostility. So when I think about a church like Exilic, the demographic can be Asian Americans, maybe younger English-speaking Asian Americans living in Manhattan, some version of that. But to ask, well, what is the dividing wall that we're seeking to breach? You can't breach all of them. And if you're trying to breach all of them, you will breach none of them. But to simply ask, what's the one thing? So is it Asian Americans, but we're going to try to breach within 3 or 4 different cultures within the Asian American experience in America? Great, you've identified that dividing wall. You're not going to get to all of them. Or it could be, when I think about like Black church, I could imagine like middle class and wealthy African Americans. What would it look like for us to breach the dividing wall of socioeconomic? So we're going to reach out to poorer, underclass African Americans. Whatever that one dividing wall is, I do believe every church is called to be part of the reconciling people of God. So the ministry of reconciliation is not optional. It's mandatory for every church. And if the church hasn't figured out what is the ministry of reconciliation that we're seeking to embody, what's the one dividing wall that we want to intentionally address, it's still missing part of its mission.
That's really good. One question we got kind of related to this was, doesn't an Asian American church contribute to the problem that the most segregated time in America is Sunday morning? I think that was a Martin Luther King quote. Doesn't the Asian American church contribute to that problem? why do we support kind of ethnic churches, but at the same time bemoan the fact that Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America? How would you differentiate that?
Let me take that one. So when MLK said that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week, what he was talking about was segregation, not separation. So when MLK talked about segregation, it was churches at that time closing their doors saying, you are not allowed, you are not welcome here because you're black, right? So that was segregation. You're closing off the doors, right? But there's a difference between segregation and separation. Separation is anyone is welcome to our church, anyone, right? But we also realize that we do need separate spaces or safe spaces where we can be ourselves and we can call home as well. We're not blocking anyone from coming, but we also recognize the importance of having a place where we can call home as well. So there's a difference between segregation and separation. So I don't think that it's actually fueling what MLK was talking about.
Anything I would add to that, I do think the multi-ethnic church that bridges between Black, White, Asian, Latino, that in America, I do think that's important. So the church that I'm part of, Redeemer East Harlem, it's a small church, but it's beautifully diverse in that sense. So I think there's an important element that there needs to be churches that are like that. But at the same time, I think this side of heaven, different ethnic groups are just in different places as far as wrestling through what does it mean for me to recognize the gifts that God has embedded in my culture that I need to bring to bear. And what does it mean for us to be all working towards this ministry of reconciliation? So not everybody is going to be called to be a multi-ethnic church, because as much as it's easy to romanticize a multi-ethnic church, but when you actually start to do the work, it is extremely difficult, and it can be extremely isolating. So even for me, City to City is a very diverse organization. We're working all across the world. Redeemer East Harlem is a very diverse congregation. But I still find some of my closest friends who are pastors are all basically Korean American. And so I stop and look at them, I'm like, is that hypocrisy? Or is there still a need for me to find spaces where I don't have to constantly do the hard work of cross-cultural love? And it's important work. It's work that we're called to. But is that something I can be doing all the time without ceasing? Or is there a need for me to be able to find the places where it's like I can set that work down and just allow myself to receive or allow myself to connect or feel a sense of belonging? So there's a tension that is inherent to that I think we all have to figure out, what does it look like for me to inhabit that tension? But I do want to reiterate, like, the ministry of reconciliation is not optional for a Christian. So if you're here today and you're a Christian, you are obligated by the Spirit of God to work towards a ministry of reconciliation. I can't tell you what that looks like. I can't tell you which dividing wall you're supposed to be tackling. You have to wrestle with that in prayer with Jesus. But it's not optional. And so what is that? And as we're all working on that, different parts of this wall, multi-ethnic churches or whatever, I think it's the corporate work that ultimately begins to demonstrate to the world that there is a higher unity, and it can only be found in Jesus.
That's really important for us to remember, that the ministry of reconciliation is not optional. I love what you said about what wall are we trying to breach? Because if what we do as an Asian American church is we escape the yoke of white-centered theology and white normativity, and now we become the new kind of dominant majority culture, and then we exclude other cultures, right? Then that's actually we're part of the we're making the problem worse. So a church like ours, we may be Asian American, right? But if the Korean Americans are making the Chinese Americans feel less welcome, and we're kind of ostracizing them, then we're actually perpetuating the problem. So I think it's really helpful to remember, okay, so what walls are we trying to breach, and in what ways are we trying to do the ministry of reconciliation? So that's a really important reminder. Moving on then to kind of from the past to this present moment. What about this, because we're titling this talk an Asian American moment. So what are you noticing kind of about the past few years, particularly in the conversations about race, that makes this kind of where the Asian American church is uniquely positioned in this moment to kind of take a stand? What are you noticing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of them in the conversation before, but I do feel like, at least from what I can tell, this is a moment where Asian Americans are starting to recognize there is a experience, a voice, an identity here that we're called to steward, right? So I do sense that there's been a shift away from downplaying that difference to saying, what does it mean that we are self-consciously and unapologetically Asian American? So I think that moment of kind of collective consciousness, to me, represents a little bit of an awakening, and I'm interested to see how that conversation begins to develop. I think when it comes to the conversation, larger racial conversation and justice conversation in the nation, I think part of the challenge is that Asian Americans have always been rendered invisible. I think part of it is our culture, where we tend to defer and that sort of everything. But I think there's been a tendency to speak of the racial problems or justice problems in America entirely in terms of black and white. And I'll affirm there are good reasons why the conversation needs to start there. So we all entered into this nation that was already in turmoil, and a lot of the liberties and freedoms that are won, so even like 1965, where some of the immigration laws change, that's coming on the heels of the repealing of Jim Crow laws. So whatever freedoms we have, we really are standing on the shoulders largely of African-American brothers and sisters who've attained those liberties for us, right? So there's good reasons why the conversations are going to be largely black and white in the U.S., but I do think we're at a moment, and part of it is the AAPI hate stuff that we experienced, that puts us in the conversation in ways that I think are important in new ways. So even in my world, in city to city, you know, in North America, I find myself in largely like black and brown spaces. So part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to cultivate a new center of gravity for the church in America that's centering minority cultures. But that space is largely black and brown. And the number of times I'm sitting in a meeting and as the only Asian American, and you know, black and brown leaders who I love, like they've become my brothers and sisters to me, but they'll be like, yeah, you know, because these are really black and brown issues, and I'm like, I'm sitting right here. So oftentimes, even for minority leaders, Asian American issues and realities are very much an afterthought, or it's just not part of that consciousness. And so for me, I'm asking, how do I inhabit that in a gracious way, inhabit that with solidarity towards some of the issues that black and brown communities face in the U.S., and yet at the same time hoping that just my presence alone or conversations raises the awareness to say, look, we're standing in solidarity with you all, but there are issues that are unique to our community that need to come to the fore as well. So I think for a lot of those reasons, I think it's an important moment. I think another piece to that is not exactly what you're asking about, but I think about this a lot. And so maybe some of you will help me to think through this more. But when you think about highest level of educational attainment and highest income bracket of any sub-demographic in America, Asian Americans are pretty close to the top. So I think even if you break it down, like I think Indian Americans are the highest, and then I think it's like Taiwanese and then Korean or something like that. So there's very, very close to the top. So I think there's something about all the educational attainment of our past generation and the earning power that comes along with that I think is a unique resource to steward for Asian American Christians. And the reason that I say that is that so much of the work in American evangelicalism today is frankly limited by funding sources. So if all of your ministry is essentially needing to be funded by white evangelicalism, there's only so far you can go with the things that you feel like are important for the future of the church. You can only go so far because you can't offend your funding sources. So when I think about one particularly important contribution to this conversation is, what if we were to cultivate a different funding source that could envision a future for the Evangelical Church in America that's not going to get stuck in all the same dead ends that I think we've run into within the conversation within white American evangelicalism. And so I think there's something there too that makes me feel like, is this potentially a uniquely Asian American moment? What would it look like if Asian Americans stood in solidarity with black and brown brothers and sisters in the faith? What would it look like if Asian Americans begin to step forward to say there's a philanthropic component to the work that we can do that can maybe begin to shift, again, the center of gravity of the Evangelical Church in America, so that it starts to look more like the globe, a much more diverse face to the church in North America.
Yeah, I'll be brief. In terms of the present moment, it does definitely seem like we are at a seminal moment, that there is an awakening taking place. So Ralph Ellison talks about the invisible man, and I think Asian Americans are tired of feeling invisible, right? W.E. Du Bois talks about double consciousness, where you're always viewing yourself through the oppressor's eyes, and that's how you see yourself. And I see that also dissipating as well, where we no longer see ourselves through other people's eyes, but we see ourselves through Christ's eyes. So it does seem like there's an awakening taking place, but I think one other layer that I'm curious about too, and there is a wave, but is the popularity also of Asian culture, like our food, our music, our dramas, our fashion. That actually has a part of the cultural impact that we are having on our world as well. And as I think about the church, how can the Asian American church have the same kind of impact that our dramas, food, and stuff like that are also happening upon our culture? And this kind of pivots to the future of the Asian American church as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's something I've been thinking about a lot too, because the general trend of Christianity in our country is decline, right? So Christianity as a cultural influence, in terms of its political power, we're seeing decline, and one of the reasons for that is every generation in our country, it kind of worked the same way, where children were raised in the church, and then they grew up and they kind of left the church, but then as they became parents, they returned to the church. Why? Because they want their children raised with Christian values. So they would come back to the church to raise their children in the church. So throughout American history, what we've seen is kind of every generation kind of raised in the church, but what we're seeing recently is that millennials are the first generation that are not returning to the church. Millennials, and then that's also going to be the case for Gen Z. So what we're seeing kind of as a trend in our country is that this country, every generation is becoming more and more secular, where they're not being raised in the church. But what's interesting about the Asian American church is kind of what you were talking about, is that mass immigration happened in the 60s and the 70s, and the church, the first generation church played such a big role in that. And what we're seeing kind of now is that similar decline that we're seeing nationally, it's not really being represented in the Asian American community. What we're actually seeing is that in a lot of Asian American churches, we're seeing a lot of people returning to the church. And that's kind of the story for a lot of people here, where you were raised in the church, and then in college you left the church, but now you're kind of discovering that for yourselves, and you're returning to the church. And what we're seeing is Asian church, a lot of Asian churches in our country kind of thriving and flourishing. So in a way, are we kind of bucking the trend where the country's zigging and we're zagging in a way? Also, kind of what you're saying is that, you guys were born in the 70s, right? I was born in the 80s.
79.
77, sorry.
We're hitting our 40s now, and my friends now are attending physicians, partners. So what we're seeing is kind of the Asian Americans, they're kind of growing up to a point where, like you said, the highest, most educated people in our country. What is that going to look like going forward when we have tremendous resources available to us, where now we're returning to the church and we can kind of leverage those resources to do a lot of good and to be resource churches and to have a lot of influence in our country? What does that look like for the future of the Asian American church? That gives me a lot of hope, kind of looking to the future.
Amen.
Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity. Like even again in the circles that I run in, Asian Americans are like disproportionately represented, I think, in like leadership within the church. And so I do think there is a higher proportion of Asian Americans. There was something about the immigrant experience where there's probably a higher percentage of evangelical Christians amongst Korean Americans than there are even amongst Koreans in Korea, right? So there's something about that. I think there was a supernatural work of God, frankly, that was going on across the entire nation. I think I'm thinking Korean American in particular, but even more broadly than that. And so I do think that God, in His wisdom and providence, has poised us for such a moment as this. And so it makes me wonder, Lord, what are you asking us to do? How are you asking us to inhabit some of these things differently? When I even think about, colleagues and friends around my age that are making partner and doing quite well and that sort of thing, one of the things that I do wonder about is I wonder about our generation of Asian Americans that are entering into that level of wealth and influence and status. Are we going to be able to inhabit that in a different sort of a way? In a way that has maybe more Christian distinctiveness, or will we just get kind of sucked into just how heady that atmosphere can be once you start to find yourself up in those circles? Is there going to be a way for us to inhabit that in a radically different way, visibly different way, so that it is counterculture? I think the key to that is going to be some of these communities where you're not only hanging out with people in your own socioeconomic class, so it normalizes certain lifestyle decisions or whatnot, but you're connected to people of all different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, and that sort of thing. Does that help ground us? But I think it remains to be seen. It's interesting, too, that when it comes to Asian Americans, last time when I preached, I mentioned beef, and I did just finish washing it because I'm Gen X, so I'm a little bit slower with all this like streaming stuff. But I did just finish washing it, and what's fascinating to me about that is it captures, I think, like the spiritual temperature of probably younger millennials and maybe early Gen Z in Asian Americans, right? So it's like, yeah, I grew up in and around the church. Like, yeah, I know that the worship leader's untouchable. Like, there are certain things that I know about. Yeah, I remember going to church just to play basketball, those sorts of things. But it makes me think about, like, Asian Americans who were born in the 90s and 2000s. Is there as deep of a connection? And where are the churches that they're going to end up in as they graduate college, enter into adulthood, have children, and that sort of a thing? And so I think a church like Exilic could be hugely impactful in that sense. Because I think about like my younger, like people in my family, like, my wife's cousins or whatever the case might be, younger folks, I'm like, man, they're all kind of a little bit wandering, would still call themselves a Christian, but it's like, I'm not going to go to that church, and just a little bit lost. And I'm like, I don't want us to lose that entire generation, and to find churches like this that are preaching the gospel but are going to be a place to belong, I think is huge. So,
one last thing. I know that this is called an Asian American moment, but as we think about our present moment, or an Asian moment, right now the U.S. sends the most amount of missionaries out into the world. South Korea is number 2. China is number 3. But in our lifetime, China will eventually be number 1, sending out the most amount of missionaries throughout the world. So as we think about a global impact, not just an American impact, China in particular is going to have a great amount of influence on the kingdom of God in our lifetime, and it's already happening.
Yeah. Man, there's a lot to think about.
Let's do future stuff.
Yeah, future stuff. Okay.
Yeah. Let me just kick off. So I talked about our dramas, our fashion, Singles Inferno, beef, all that stuff. I love it. I love that kimchi and gochujang is being sold at Trader Joe's and Costco. But I also dream of a day where we also contribute our faith as well to our nation. Now, the black community has contributed so much to the entire body of Christ, right? The blues, jazz, gospel music, gospel preaching, that is very unique, right? It's influenced by liberation theology. They've contributed so much to justice and race. Like the list goes on and on in terms of how the black church has influence the greater body of Christ in greater ways. Now think about the Asian American church. What have we done? What have we contributed to the greater body of Christ? And I would say not much. And it can't be a bad version of Tim Keller and a bad version of Chris Tomlin and Hillsong. That can't be our legacy. Okay, our legacy has to be something that is greater than that. And a part of the reason why we haven't contributed as much as we could is because of our assimilation tendencies and being white adjacent. But as we get more comfortable with who we are and what God is doing in our own lives and our identity in Christ, I think at that moment, now we can start talking about, well, what is Asian American theology? What does Asian American preaching look like, music look like? And what can we do to actually help the greater body of Christ? Not just because this is our cultural moment and this is the wave that we want to ride, but we actually want to help our non-Asian brothers and sisters. Just as the Black community has helped us, what can we offer for the sake of our brothers and sisters? And because there are blind spots within the body of Christ, we have something unique, a unique perspective that we have to offer, but we have to know what that is. And I have some thoughts on that, but this is very self-serving, but I actually think Asian American theology is exilic. I know it's very self-serving, but I'm a part of the SOLA network, and our council is actually writing a book right now that will be published in April. Every council member and some others are contributing one chapter each, and the chapter that I'm writing on is Asian American theology. What is it? I actually do think that it's exilic. And we know better than anyone else what it's like to be a resident alien, to be immigrants, to not feel like we're at home. We know the importance of home. We know what it's like where our citizenship is in another country. And there's a lot that we can unpack when it comes to exile. But scripture from Genesis to Revelation is all about exile. Adam and Eve were exiled east of Eden. Abraham was a nomad. The Israelites were exiled, they left into the wilderness. All the major and minor prophets that we don't really know what they're talking about, it's either talking about their deportation to Babylon or their return home from exile. Jesus Christ was the ultimate exile from heaven to earth. The Christian diaspora is referred to as aliens, strangers, sojourners, and exiles. I mean, the list goes on, and we have a very unique perspective that we have to offer to the greater kingdom of God, because I think this perspective is important because Scripture talks about it as well. So those are just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think when the Bible uses the category of a sojourner in this world, right? So Asian Americans know what it's like to be home and yet never fully be embraced as someone who's home. Right? We know what that's like. We know what it's like to inhabit a place that will never fully receive us, and yet nevertheless a place where we're going to make a home for ourselves, right? So when I think a lot about what's happening in just kind of American evangelicalism, and I think a lot of the fear that is leading to kind of a heightened culture wars, like I interpret that a lot of it as American Christianity has no idea what it would look like to be the church outside of the halls of power. It feels catastrophic for American Christianity. And I look at that, I'm like, well, I think we know a little bit about that. Like we know what it's like to be faithful to Jesus outside of the halls of power. And when I think about future leadership for the American church, whether we like it or not, we are heading towards a future where Christians are going to be increasingly in the minority, where America is going to become increasingly more of a pluralistic country. And so to have leadership that feels comfortable with following Jesus on the outside of the halls of power, in exile, knowing what that's like, and knowing that this is actually the place where God sometimes does some of his best work, I think there's going to be a huge need for that kind of non-anxious leadership that I think will grow out of our experiences. So not only our theology, but the kind of leadership that Asian Americans can bring. I think there's a lot to that, that sojourner, that hyphenated, the exile, the alien, that we know what that looks like.
And just to add to that, the response might be, well, your kids, my kids who are 7 to 5, they might not feel the same way that we felt growing up, right? Because they actually feel like, I don't know, they feel less of a minority, let's say. So how important is this theology of exile to the next generation? And I would say very important, because I don't think the problem of race is going to get fixed anytime soon. Secondly, they have to stand on the shoulders of someone, right? And they will tell their own story, but that story has to be built on our story. And unless we know what our story is and what our contribution is, they're going to have their feet firmly planted in midair. So they have to stand on our shoulders, but they can't unless we know what we're doing and what we're talking about. So it's equally important for the next generation, even though my kids don't feel as much of an outsider as we do. So it's going to be important for them too.
Yeah, I think a lot about that as my kids grow up. They're going to grow up really kind of liberated from the model minority myth. What is that going to be like for them formatively, psychologically, in terms of the way they view themselves? So it is fascinating. And I think it's really important, Abe, what you were saying. As Christianity, the cultural influence of it declines, I think it's all the more important for us to listen to prophets and voices that are outside of that are from the margins. So what is one way that we can kind of diversify? Because, for example, when Aaron and I were in seminary, we didn't read any theology or anything from non-white sources. And I think psychologically what that told us was the whites are the experts and everyone else is kind of JV. So what are some ways that we can kind of diversify who we listen to, who our experts are, who the prophets are kind of going forward into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that crucial insight of, so when you think about when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, and so the way that, Tim Keller used to talk about, he would talk about how the kingdom of God is an inside out, upside down, forward back kingdom, right? So it's inside out in that it's grace that changes you, and then from the inside it changes your behavior. So the way that the kingdom of God infiltrates a heart is an inside out power. It's by grace alone. But the upside down piece is that in the kingdom of God, it inverts all of our instincts around power. And so the way up is the way down. The way to greatness is to serve. The way that you keep your wealth is to give it all away. Right? So all of those elements, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is radically inverting all of our sense of power and influence. Right? So it's the poor who are blessed. It's the meek who are blessed, that sort of thing. And then the forward back is that the future kingdom of God coming back. But this piece of the upside down kingdom, I think, is crucially important, because when it comes to how we think about our theology, recognizing that in the kingdom of God, it's going to be out on the margins that we're going to be seeing the Spirit of God working in pretty remarkable ways. I think that's part of what it means for the kingdom of God to be an upside down kingdom. Or the way that one person put it, he said that the future is here. It's just on the margins. It's already happening. And so I think there is a particular kingdom impulse, I would say, let's be intentional about inverting all of our instincts around power, paying attention to what's happening on the margins. And so even in our theological reflection, I think that's crucially important. I think there are so many voices out there that you can read if you just do a little bit of digging. Maybe a great place to start for me has been John Stott, a generation ago, was very intentional about cultivating a next generation of global voices, global scholars. So when I think about some names that come to mind immediately are like Orlando Costas, Rene Padilla. These are all folks who are evangelical in their core, but they are global voices that I think we all need to listen to. I think there are there's a strong tradition in the Black church. So I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for me is one of very significant theological influence. But there's a lot to be gleaned if we're just intentional about hearing from a diverse palette of voices. And I think Asian American theology, I think it's time for us to have more authors who are reflecting on these things that, again, at core are orthodox in their faith, and yet recognizing there's something about our social location that we bring a crucial contribution to the entire conversation. I'll say one last thing. I think recognizing, so how should I put this? Our social location around theology, I think, is crucially important because as creatures, we were never meant to look at theology as though we don't have a social location, if that makes sense. So omniscience is a non-communicable attribute of God. What do I mean by that? We were never meant to strive towards omniscience as creatures. And the more we try to establish this view from nowhere or view from everywhere, we're committing idolatry because we're trying to be what only God can be. So embracing the socially located realities of who we are when we think is actually the right creaturely response to God's self-revelation in Scripture. We can never translate our embodiedness and embeddedness socially. And so part of what that means as Asian Americans is for us to do theology, we're not called to shed the particularities of our social location. Again, that's idolatry. Instead, we're meant to say what in our particular social location helps us to see more clearly into the aspects of who God has revealed himself to be. And so I think there's an embracing of that I think the more that we seek to transcend it, I think we're losing our place as creatures before the Creator. The more we embrace it, the more we honor Christ, who is seeking to reveal all these things to the nations and gathering them up in himself.
Yeah, just to add to that, Esau Macaulay wrote a book called Reading While Black. And what he was writing about was how black people have a unique way of seeing Scripture because of their social location and their perspective. And I do wonder what it would look like to read while Asian, because we also have a unique perspective and a social location, and because of that, we can see things that other people cannot see. And so the question is, what perspective will we provide for the greater body of Christ to strengthen the body of Christ as well?
We are nearing the end of our time. I've been trying to kind of field some of the questions and incorporate them into our talk so far. I just have a few that I'd like to kind of end our time with. The first question is, what would be the best way to be a part of Exilic or other Asian American Pacific Islander churches as someone who's not AAPI, as someone who's not Asian? Would it be better to not invade this space, or what contributions can they make to a church like ours or other Asian churches?
No, please come. If anything, I think my heart breaks more when I know that someone that is non-Asian comes and I feel like they're not going to come back because we're too Asian. And so I think for your sake, it'll make your faith more holistic. You'll have a better understanding of the whole body of Christ. If you are a part of a community that you are not used to, it'll actually strengthen your faith because of the unique perspectives and challenges and convictions that we have as well. So I would actually welcome that. I wouldn't turn people away because I think it could actually be good for you as well, particularly if you're from a majority culture and you're now the minority, because this is our reality every single day, actually, and it helps you understand the body of Christ better.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately I'll go back to that vision of being the reconciling church, and so I think people of all different backgrounds coming together under Jesus is a crucial part of it. So if that's what you're doing here at Exilic, would continue to encourage you to do so. I think at the same time, for you to recognize, okay, I'm not going to feel unduly alienated if I'm part of a community that's kind of, unapologetically going to be an Asian American context. But to recognize I want to commit to doing the cross-cultural work to enter into this space because God has called me to cross-cultural love. I think there are also, as you think about your own culture, and again, this might be more true of dominant culture folks than, if you're African American or Latino in this space, but if you're coming from the dominant culture, it will force you to reflect on what are my cultural distinctives as a white American that I can maybe bring to bear in this community as well. I think part of the realities of being dominant culture is that you're rarely self-reflective on your own culture because, that's kind of what sets the table. And so to engage, in that sense, as an ethnic minority in this space, there are a lot of riches that you can bring to the conversation as well. And so, but it's just kind of shifting some of the cultural dynamics where most multi-ethnic churches are kind of white dominant culture and then ethnic minorities flexing into that white dominant culture. This is going to be a little bit different space where the dominant culture here is going to be largely Asian American And as a white dominant culture person flexing into that, I think it's part of a new reality that I'm curious to see what the Spirit's going to do on. But your contribution, I think, is essential.
Yeah, I think growing theologically is important, but growing experientially is equally important. And so I think this is why it helped me when I was a missionary overseas, and why everyone should actually go overseas, because it helps you understand what it means to be a resident alien as a follower of Jesus. And so if you're not Asian and you're a part of our church, like, you're experiencing something, and that can actually help your discipleship. And so I actually have a lot of respect for people that are a part of our church that are not Asian. And you know, Jay is such a great friend, but when I first met him, Dr. Harvey, I was like, I'm not going to talk to him because he's not going to come back. And then he came back, and he brought his whole family. And now he's been with us like 5-6 years. But when I initially saw him, I was like, he's not going to be a part of our community, but he is. And we're richer for it, and I think he's also richer for it as well. So I'm really grateful for that.
Maybe one question to end our time with. Can we discern maybe one affirmation and one rebuke from God about the Asian American church or culture? What might those be?
Maybe I could start with the rebuke first.
In good Asian style.
Yes. I mean, Abe alluded to it, but we do bring, you know, Revelation 7, Revelation 20, we bring our ethnicity into eternity. Jesus is still very much Jewish today. He's a male today. He still has his body, and you will very much be Asian American in heaven as well. It's not as though we become these androgynous, raceless creatures when we go to heaven. So we still have our bodies, and we still have our ethnicity, and I think the rebuke would be when we have self-hatred and we have a sense of shame at how God made us. And I think that is a rebuke that we have been listening to. I don't think that everyone quite yet has been listening to that rebuke, but it's something that we need to think about more and more. You will still very much be Asian American when you go to heaven, and this is how God has made you, and you should be unapologetic about that. So that's the rebuke.
Yeah, I think the affirmation goes back to, you know, all of our experiences, again, being home but never fully home, not having any other home aside from this place, and yet never feeling fully accepted in this place that we would call home. As uncomfortable and as much as there might be resentments and hurts that go along with that, I think the affirmation is that has formed you in a way to follow Jesus that Christians from many other cultures need to learn from you on. So there's something about that experience that I think is a huge, huge asset that we can bring to the church in America, certainly, but also the global church. So I would say just lean into that and trust that that's part of how God has embedded his riches in your experience particularly, with all the hurts and wounds and resentments that come along and embarrassments that come along with that. So I'd want to affirm that. Other Christians of other backgrounds need that from us. Like they need that from us. It will be incomplete without us in that sense. I mean, I think for the rebuke for me, I guess would be, guys, let's just lead. Like, let's stop asking for permission. Let's stop waiting for someone to ask us to do it. Let's just lead. There are incredible resources in the Asian American community in the church. The amount of talent and vision and competency that's represented in the Asian American church is astounding. Let's just lead. Let's stop waiting for somebody to tell us it's our turn. It's our turn. Let's just do it.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase, if you don't get a seat at the table, you know, build your own chair. I would say build your own table, too, if that's what it takes. Because God has given us resources and giftings, and we're called to steward those for the sake of the kingdom of God. So it's really important.
Just following up with that, I think a clear rebuke is that Asian Americans have classically or traditionally tended to view church more consumeristically, where a church is about what can I get, how can I benefit. But I think a rebuke would be, no, you have so much to offer. There's so much that God has blessed you with that now you can kind of invest into others. So I think that is an encouragement and a challenge and a rebuke for us not to kind of just sit back and keep trying to take, but really to pay it forward and to invest in others. I think that's
the secondary calling stuff.
All right, well, that's our time for today. I was super encouraged by this, and hopefully we will do more of this. We would love your feedback. I'm sure Heidi will send out some sort of poll in the future. But we would also like to follow up with some recommended resources as well. We were originally going to kind of display them, but because our projectors are down, we will most likely kind of post some recommended resources on our website. So we will follow up with that. Maybe it'll go in our Justice Committee website page. But we'll have some if this conversation was interesting to you and helpful for you, then we'll have some recommended resources where you can read more and follow up more as well. All right. Well, thank you all.